We know so much more than we used to about the world of the First Floridians, and yet we know almost nothing about who they were.
So these are the kind of things that we're interested in, or at least I am. What people were doing, how they related to these landscapes, and how people interacted with one another, and to what extent.
At Page Ladson, I mean, the archaeological assemblage is something like a dozen flakes, and how are you supposed to reconstruct somebody's life, a group of people's life, based on a dozen flakes?
Page Ladson site, it's a couple of flakes, it's a single biface. It's difficult to interpret human activity based on that. So the future really is finding additional Page Ladsons, additional archaeological sites within a similar context with more artifacts, so we can actually start to learn and understand what Florida's early indigenous people were actually doing on the landscape and how they were utilizing the landscape and living during the late Pleistocene.
A couple of years after finding the knife at Page Ladson, Morgan started work on the Ryan-Harley site, just upstream on the Wassissa River.
So this is kind of funny to think about, but imagine 9 years ago, a flat, swampy area, lots of engine noise, dogs barking, people talking, artifacts being processed, a big blue tarp over this area with a bunch of waterlogged archaeologists whose feet never dried for 2 months while they were out here. And this was our camp. This is how we excavated Ryan-Harley.
Ryan-Harley was first excavated in the 1990s after Ryan and Harley Means found Suwannee projectile points in the river channel.
Back in '99, we did, I guess you could call it sort of salvage archaeology work. The site was eroding, and Harley and I happened to be there, and both of us were diving, and we went right up and sniffed out exactly where the stuff was coming from.
After Morgan excavated the site in 2015, he shared his finds at the Florida Geological Survey.
He's got over 1,000 things. Everything here is from in situ, which is an archaeologist's dream, to do that and be able to piece back what you can of the site. He's going to make the next major contribution to Suwannee Point technology in Florida, which will be interesting to read.
It's easy to think of projectile points almost as marker fossils, especially when we have solid dates on them at well-dated archaeological sites. However, the issue in Florida and a large part of the Southeast is a lot of these late Pleistocene, early Holocene projectile points, we know they exist. You have your Suwannee, Simpson, and Clovis projectile points, but none of them are really well-dated whatsoever in the entire Southeast.
Clovis points are found throughout the continent, but Suwannee and Simpson points are only found in and around Florida. Because they're local, it's likely they came after Clovis.
And it kind of looks like these Clovis ancestors are settling into certain geographic areas and kind of marking out territory that they're adapted to and that they reside within.
These people adapted to Florida and places like the Wassissa, but not the Wassissa we know today.
The modern Wassissa River, as we see it here today, was not flowing like this when the Suwannee people lived here. So this would have been instead a vast sand sheet, similar to a coppice, shrubby, small elevation dune field. And it looks like the Suwannee people camped on the backside of one of these dunes, and nearby there's a deep depression that might have been a water hole or a small ephemeral pond. These people are on a vast open landscape without reliable water, moving up and down these drainages, trying to find food, trying to find water, trying to find shelter in a time when there's not as many resources available as there are today.
The tools they made helped them survive in this environment.
Suwannee people had a flexible, adaptive toolkit strategy, which we kind of expect from their ancestors that were very mobile. So they had things like adzes, woodworking implements, tools that were probably also used to work bone, hide-working instruments like scrapers, which tells us that Suwannee people are still overall uncertain about what they're going to face, because if you have a flexible toolkit, it's probably because you're not really sure what the next month or 3 months or year look like for you.
Not all sites have projectile points or stone tools, but they may still have something to tell us about the people who had been there.
At the archaeological site I've been working on for my dissertation, the Ladybug site, we actually haven't found any projectile points in situ. The only artifacts we've found in situ are these chert flakes that range in size from about this big to about this big. Now, these indicate people are on the landscape because it's the debris that they're leaving behind while they're making these stone tools. So we know people were on the landscape making stone tools even without having those stone tools themselves.
So if you think about the early Paleo-Indian period, we know that they made stone tools, and we know that they followed reliable water sources and maybe also big game around the landscape. But honestly, other than that, we don't really have a lot of information on them. These people were tied to the land, and they had relationships, and they had kids, and they had ideas of religion and cosmology, and we can't really get to any of that.
We have these big questions we want to answer to, again, understand our shared human past. And we have many different lines of evidence we can use.
And I really want to emphasize, it's not one single line of evidence that we look for. They always say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? To paraphrase Carl Sagan.
Many lines of evidence are environmental. We've already learned about the paleo environment from herbivore fossils, pollen, and sea level. Sea level is tied to climate. And just over 12,000 years ago, a major climate event would have rocked the environment.
In the Younger Dryas, of course, there's this huge climate disturbance, and the ecosystems drastically change.
The climate is overall warming and warming and warming, and then within the period of a couple generations, things go back to really cold, really windy, really arid.
If you look at the onset of the Younger Dryas, that probably happened over a few generations. And they were probably, if you got people who are reacting to what the environment gives them for their foodway, well, any kind of change in that, any perturbance in that in some way, like they're going to have to adjust, and that's going to be reflected in the archaeological record.
Animals die, plants die, ecosystems shift, sea level rises very quickly during punctuated points, and the Suwannee people lived during all of this.
Not only did animals die, they went extinct.
What we've discovered recently is that there are fungal spores that can tell us a whole bunch of information about the environment also. And so one of the most interesting ones, in my opinion, are coprophyllous fungal spores. These fungal spores are primarily associated with large herbivore dung. So things like mastodons and mammoths are going to be contributing many more fungal spores to a record than something like a deer or rabbit.
And right at 12,700-ish, the concentration of those spores in the sediment record of Page-Ladson just drops off the charts. So it's just gone. So that gives us a good idea of the date for megafauna extinction and extirpation in the area.
That's when the cascade of ecological change happens, because mega herbivores are keystone species. And so when they are removed from a landscape, we see all sorts of ecological changes like vegetation change, but also increased fire.
Not only do sediments contain spores and pollen, but also charcoal from wildfires.
What we find in Florida is that fire was always present on the landscape. Prior to the decline of mega herbivores, those mega herbivores were reducing the vegetation enough that even when there were fires, maybe they weren't big enough or widespread enough to leave a big record in paleoecological archives. But after their extinction, we see a pretty significant increase in fire.
The loss of large mammals changed the landscape, increased the frequency of wildfires, and removed a considerable amount of protein for early Floridians. In other ways, it made Florida a safer place.
There are several species of big cat. The biggest of them is the American lion. Also quite sizable is the famous Smilodon fatalis. Those two are lion to tiger-sized cats. There was a large jaguar, slightly smaller than them, but still quite capable of killing a human being.
The same species of jaguar still roam South America today, and Florida was also home to Florida panthers.
Then there are the dire wolves, which are in packs and they're larger than modern wolves. There are two species of bears. The alligators grew much bigger because, there weren't people trapping them.
Large herbivores were almost as dangerous.
Or even the elephant and the mammoths and mastodons are not going to go down easy. So there was quite a bit of risk in that habitat.
About 30 species of mammals, predators and herbivores alike, went extinct by the start of the Younger Dryas. Early Floridians settled into a place that was in a constant state of flux. They would have to have been adaptable people. Changes in their culture would have gone hand in hand with changes in the world around them.
These are really abrupt changes. So potentially, depending on how long someone's life is, they could have seen these changes within the span of a long life.
This was a rapidly changing climate. I'm sure that had impact on longevity. It probably had impact on animals' well-being, so there was probably all sorts of problems associated with sourcing food and finding water, and that creates stress and malnutrition, which creates intergroup conflict, and I'm sure there's all these things that we're missing.
What to me is even more interesting is what comes after the Younger Dryas, because then you had the inverse happen. It ended as abruptly as it started, in a relatively short amount of time, it got warm. It started this warming trend that lasted several millennia.
It continued to warm, and sea level continued to rise. But it was a more stable time than the Paleo-Indian period.
The Archaic period on the early end is kind of one of the first big transitions in projectile point technology, where we moved from these lancelet shapes overall to notched varieties. And the Archaic tends to stem from 11,000 to 3,000 on the end of the Archaic period, so it's a huge chunk of time. Whereas some of the other cultural periods are a couple thousand or a couple hundred years. This is a massive chunk of time, and there's a lot going on in the Archaic period.
After the last glacial maximum, you start to have an increase in the water table. So you've got glaciers that are melting, they're adding a lot of water to the oceans, and then it's charging the aquifers in Florida, more fresh water, more resources, and then people start exploiting marine resources as well. So now you can have bigger groups.
We start to see kind of people developing into complex centers where they have a base camp and they're staging resources from around an area. This is where we kind of see people adapting to the coast specifically for the first time. So they're living on the coast. They have these gigantic shell deposits, some of which have burials in them, and some of them have funerary remains and artifacts from all aspects of daily life.
Not all Middle Archaic people buried their dead in mounds.
I studied Middle Archaic period mortuary ponds. Florida has a unique cultural practice during the early and Middle Archaic period where people were interring their deceased in saturated freshwater environments with a lot of peat. They were basically placing the deceased person in those sediments, and they would use worked stakes to hold the people in place, maybe to mark the burials. And this was happening around 7,000 years ago. Wendover is the most well-known. It's over on the East Coast.
Wendover was excavated by Florida State University in the 1980s, led by Dr. Glenn Doran. Researchers found 168 individuals preserved under a shallow pond. This type of burial was not widely practiced.
These ponds, there are about 7 of them, I believe. Most of these are in Central Florida, and they have a tight time period. So it's just very interesting to have mortuary ponds in a very specific region in Florida, very tight timeline.
There may be more mortuary ponds offshore. Offshore sites from a similar time period are shedding light on a landscape more similar to modern Florida.
I specialize in a period that we call the Middle Holocene, so from around 8,000 years ago up until 5,000 or 4,000 years ago, depending on who you want to argue with. And by that point, sea level had been rising for quite some time, for almost 10,000 years. And it was slowing down a bit, but it hadn't stopped. And so what you've got is a situation where it is a climate more similar to that of today, right? So the tree cover had come back and the plants had proliferated, and of course the megafauna were gone by that point, but coastal resources were coming online. And that meant that you could go down to the seashore, you could go down to the tidal marsh, and you could access all different manner of shellfish, like oysters.
Middle Holocene people harvested oysters from a coastline that was on the move.
So there's some things that we know that we didn't know 50 years ago. One of them is that people were harvesting shellfish in great quantities at a time when the sea level was not stable. Okay, so that throws out the window the idea that people didn't bother to use the coastline until it was stable. If we know that we've got coastal resource usage during the Middle Holocene, then that suggests to us that we perhaps want to follow the old coastline seaward, continue further back in time, sort of in a leapfrog fashion, right? From Ecofina Channel site out to a site called Ray Hole Springs. It's approximately 20 miles maybe. And Ray Hole Springs had oyster deposits that weren't closely examined. Got a radiocarbon date from a piece of wood, just under 8,000 years old. It would have been a flowing spring. Was Ray Hole Springs an intermediate kind of site? Right? Well, I couldn't tell you that because I haven't been on it and I don't have a lot of data from it. But working the Middle Holocene sites, documenting that contrary to old expectations, people were adaptable, were flexible, could live on the coast at this time when it was not stable, suggests to us that we can follow that trend further into the offshore.
Further offshore lie older coastlines and the potential to find older sites. Perhaps people did harvest oysters before the Middle Holocene, despite an ever-shifting coastline. Eventually, though, the coast settled.
About 6,000 years ago, the sea level rise rate slowed down markedly, and we got to what we call a still stand of sea level. And 6,000 years ago, that is when the barrier islands formed, coastal deltas formed, and so that's when people really could establish themselves on the coastline in a more permanent way. There's evidence on St. Vincent Island that there was a large settlement there. There's pottery, there's large middens of oyster shells, and so probably people were down there eating oysters to their heart's content.
A stable environment meant less stressful lives for Floridians, who started to leave behind more evidence of creative expression.
And the woodland period in Florida is really typified by ceramics. So ceramics actually start in the late Archaic period, but they really explode in the woodland period. And that's when you see a lot of micro-regionality starting to happen in Florida. So specific drainage basins, specific river basins, very specific geographic areas have their own types of ceramic markers.
It was a long journey to get here from here. To learn the story of the people who made these, it has likewise been a long journey from here to here. As Florida became itself, the waters that define our state hid away hundreds of generations of stories and preserved them. In recent years, more and more people are learning how to uncover them.
There's not many of us still, even though the last couple years we've seen the number of practitioners at like the master's level probably double or even triple from where it was just 10 years ago. The students are definitely the future.
The number of people working in submerged Florida landscapes is growing, and they're taking what they learned here to other places in the country.
The very first underwater archaeology project I did was in the Gulf of Mexico. I think the biggest thing that project accomplished, honestly, was training like a whole new generation of students to do that work.
Using knowledge gained in the Gulf, Ashley and her team learned something surprising about early Holocene hunters up north.
We didn't know until working underwater that peoples in the Great Lakes 9,000 years ago were building these types of hunting structures. They were completely unprecedented. Nobody knew. And luckily, they were preserved underwater.
Across the Gulf, new technologies are allowing researchers to explore a site remotely without disturbing it.
There's really also, I think, a fantastic opportunity to bring new technologies, emerging technologies that allow us to document the world in ways that we really hadn't considered before, and to really think about ways of how to best visualize those data, how to share those data, how to maybe extract measurements, or to better characterize using different digital tools.
The next page Latson might be hiding on the Oscilla, or far out in the Gulf of Mexico. It could be near your favorite swim hole or fishing spot. The sediments beneath Florida waters hold stories waiting to be unearthed. Each new site brings us closer to understanding the lives of the First Floridians and the hundreds of generations that followed them.